Google. Okay. Hello, hello. Pardon me if I'm continuously checking phone, as I'm sure a lot of other people are. All right, I'm going to give it like another minute or so before I get started because there's only 5 people on. Hello! And I want to make sure that lots of people can see the stream. But I can sense that it might be a little slower today. Okay, 6 watching. That's okay. 7. Hello. Oh, shoot. That's why. Thank you for the heads up. I posted in the wrong channel. That's what happens when you're in a hurry. Hello. All right, I'll get started. Well, people filter in. So, hello. Thank you for, being cool with, the change on Tuesday. While everybody was able to, while you had the time to go vote. Thank you if you've used it, and if you didn't, that's cool too. But So today, what we're going to talk about is animating or acting and force versus form. Now, these are 2 topics for which you could one of them is literally its own book. Actually, kind of 2 of them are. But I'm, as with anything, like a lecture, one class lecture is really like a summary of a greater body of knowledge. So this is like the Cliff Notes version, and some people like just reading Cliff Notes and other people like digging in. I would recommend definitely digging into these topics, because if you can continue, it's like the principles. A lot of you have really done the work of digging in and mastering them, or trying to master them, or maybe getting close to mastering them. But this is something that, again, will really help you continue to develop your skill as an animator. So, again, this is like a starting point. Definitely I'd say continue to beef up your understanding of it outside the lecture. And for that, I actually did in the animation link share channel of Discord, I've added a link to, at least for the acting portion, the information, like the page with like the full information, which are the notes from like a workshop on acting for animators. There's also a book, Acting for Animators, that's based on all this stuff. So that's a very important book on animation. I definitely recommend going and checking it out. And again, as usual, I'm catching up with grading. I actually am really enjoying grading your stuff, because then I get to see like all the little animations, which is a lot of fun, instead of just staring at PowerPoint. So, but again, like, I'm seeing a lot of really awesome development from all of you. So, keep it up. Way to go. You're getting there. A few general things, like, don't be afraid. I still see like a lot of trepidation to not just draw what you think is reality, but remember, animation is representation, not simulation. So don't be afraid to really have those breakdowns from like a facial expression change to like down before up and things like that. So, I even just did one yesterday that I've shared in Share Your Work, where, I have a character go from like to, and, the character goes, like, does a little, it's like, so, and that's only like in 4 frames because it's for a game, so it's a little simpler, but you can still accomplish a lot with your animation. It makes it look better if you have a anticipation when you do facial change expressions and things like that. Also, don't be afraid to either rotate or distort something to match, like have follow through on actions, especially physics actions. So even if you're drawing something like a hard edged object, don't be afraid to either like bend it a little bit to make it look more interesting when it's like there was one that was a hammer hitting a nail, and it was a nice animation, but it was just sort of like dook dook, as opposed to like so there was no like wind up or bending. Even if you don't want to do a bending, you can have like the hammer have a delay on how it actually rotates, so that you get the idea that the head is heavier and things like that. Same thing with like, don't be afraid to practice using smear frames, because if you can use smear frames, that also gives you an impression of really fast motion, and you would use that as one of your in-betweens. But that can be nice to, again, create the idea of momentum and acceleration. But in terms of this lecture, so that was just stuff about your animations in general that I've been observing. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to pop them in the chat. But today, the topics I'm going to cover are 2 major things. One is acting for animators. The other is force versus form. And again, these are summaries of bigger, broader materials. So please go check those out. So the screenshot here is a frame from the Blender Open movie from, I think it's like 8 or 9 years ago at this point, Big Buck Bunny. And I think it's like in the special features of this DVD. I wish I learned the magic of smears earlier. They're so useful. They are super useful. They are really nice, like for when you need to communicate motion. We were having, for those who missed it, we were having a conversation about drawing smear frames in the chat one day, and basically it amounts to like what I've used as a rule of thumb for myself is, whatever, like, wherever you have between your breakdown and your keyframe or your two keyframes or whatever it is, to do a smear frame, it's like what's the frame 1 where the motion is starting, what's frame 2 where the motion is ending, and then the smear frame will probably be a frame that just has like a smear between like just after the start frame and just before the finish frame. And that really gives you, so you just kind of have like, and then you just make this, mashed potato version. Whether that be your smear frame is just like a bunch of stretchy versions of something, or whether the smear frame be just like a stretched out, as though you, I don't know, imprinted a picture on silly putty and stretched it kind of stretch. That's kind of up to you stylistically, but that will really help. Basically the smear starts from the like position of the frame before and ends on the position of the frame after, and then it's just mush in between, whatever that mush looks like in your style. That's like my rule of thumb for using them. So but yeah, they are super useful. So the image is from an open movie called Big Buck Bunny, and I can't find the actual video of this, but I know, for example, like when the animators were animating this like shot of the bunny getting hit in the head with acorns by these like troublesome squirrels, they actually would they film themselves throwing tennis balls at their own head and reacting to the tennis balls, and then they just use that as a means of like copying the motion. So we're going to talk about like acting in that way. A lot of this again is going to come from Ed Hooks's awesome book called Acting for Animators, which is in its like 4th edition. It's a really cool book that you should check out. I need to even get my own copy. I've seen stuff from it though, and obviously we're going to use stuff from it. But that's a big recommendation there. So we want to talk about acting. I've said this before, but animation is not, again, like, I hope you've realized by now, this is not a process of software and just making enough drawings to get things to move. This is a process of motion. It's a process of emotion. It's a process of communicating with an audience and trying to have your audience empathize with your characters. And in that way, you are acting through your characters, even though you are not, physically getting on a stage. Camera adjustment. Even though you're not physically getting on a stage and moving around, or doing your own, even though you're not acting in a very traditional way, you are, for all intents and purposes, an actor in this thing you're doing. You just happen to be acting through a character that you draw or animate, at your desk or in a 3D program. So I need to ignore my notes because I just went through all of the. I'm using the PowerPoint notes, but I didn't make any new notes for this lecture, so I'm going to go off the slides, and they're all like from several lectures ago, so I got to ignore them. I can't teach you how to be an actor in one lecture. That would be attributing way too much power to me as a teacher or to these slides. But what I can tell you is, we're going to go over some basic things to keep in mind as you think about your acting for animation. And this is actually why I sent the write-up, for the full version of this, and I'm recommending the book so much, because this is going to seem all very theoretical. And I've tried to condense it into something that will seem practical and that you'll be like, okay, yeah, I can see how this works. So bear with me, ask lots of questions, but so it's going to kind of start seeming a little fluffy, but we're gonna, you'll see how it comes together at the end. So, here's some quotes again from Ed Hooks's stuff. Movement expresses a thought. Your job is to lead the audience. So the best acting allows windows into a character, and really what you're doing. Another thing that he says is it's best to play an action until you have a reason to play another action. By playing an action, it means like the actor is doing something, doing an activity until there is a external reason to stop doing that activity and doing another. And that seems kind of like duh, but you'll see what I'm getting at there. So, you've heard this acting joke probably, but what's my motivation in this scene? But you actually, there is an element of reality to that in acting. What this comes down to is that when you act and when you're animating or you're acting through your animation, it's the same thing as when you are acting on a stage. You have a character. That character has some goal, some motivation, some emotional context, and it is your job as the person bringing that character to life. Again, whether you're on a stage or whether you are at a drawing desk or at a computer, to give that character the emotional context that your audience will be able to connect with them. So it's about emotion. It's about what the character is thinking internally. It's what the character wants. And actors like to talk about internals and externals. So internals are the emotions and personalities of a character. The externals are the character's poses and facial expressions. And there is a paradox for animators because, an actor will mainly focus on the internals. They care deeply about who the character is. I've mentioned, people I've known who are actors, and they would be, in like the chorus, sort of like the Greek chorus type thing in a stage play, and they would like develop this whole backstory of who this person is, and you're like, wow, that sounds really amazing. And then you go see the play, and then they're just like in the back reacting to the stuff that the main actors are doing. And it seems like a silly exercise, but in reality, coming up with a backstory, even if you are a background character, and by the way, when I say the chorus, I mean like, a group of characters in the back that reacts to the main action and provides some emotional context, and often like maybe, chants something depending on the form of the play. So in musical theater, they might like be backup singers too as well. So the way that, even if somebody's in something like a chorus, they might come up with their own like whole set of backstory and emotional context for this character so that it makes their performance more genuine. And if it seems like extra work you don't want to do, well, too bad. Then you won't be as good of an animator as the people that are doing that work. So the paradox, though, is that in acting, you are instructed when you are learning to be an actor to come up with all of this background information and base everything on these internals. The externals are really just like the afterthought. You come up with all the internal stuff, you try to put your character in the place of being in that like internal emotional state, and then as a result of that, the character smiles or frowns or gasps in a certain way. Whereas, animators, our stock in trade is the external. We are drawing poses, like what have we been looking at? Poses, expressions, motions, things like that. So our difficulty is that because we are not the character, we are drawing the character or posing the character or modeling the character, we have to find that bridge between the internal and the external. We need to figure out, we have to get ourselves into that place as we draw. And that can be really tough because, especially if you are doing a hand-drawn animation like we have been. One of you asked me when I posted a picture of the Bosco GIF into Discord, how long did it take? And from beginning to end, roughs to ink and paint, it took about 3 weeks to get everything done. It was a big animation. It was like a big shot, but and I'm not saying that it's like a big emotional scene. I did a little bit with that guy on top, the way I described him as like I wanted to give him a 3 years till I get my pension attitude, where he's just sort of like, maybe Nemo is doing this thing that's on the screen right now, being very excited, like, wow, a dragon. The guy's like drives the dragon every day and is like, oh, this stupid thing. He's kind of over it maybe, and there's a contrast between those two characters that'll make it funny. So we can, when you do stuff like that, think about it like it taking weeks to make an animation like that, a 5-second animation. And that's backed up to, like, if you look at there's a video clip that I put as one of the case studies in one of the earlier weeks on production. It had an animator from Aladdin say like, hey, here's my 6 seconds of Aladdin moving, and it took me 3 weeks to do this 6 seconds. And like, again, that's a Disney guy. And that's on, that's with full in-betweens and smooth motion and things like that. When the point I'm getting at with like how long it takes is that think about if you're working, let's say 9 to 5 every day, and you're just drawing, and you are working on that 6-second animation for weeks on end, you are basically having to sit down and put yourself in the internal place of that character as an actor for weeks. You're having to live that motivation for weeks, as opposed to, okay, here's my scene in my play. So this is where the internals and externals become complicated. Is you want to understand the internals of the character. You probably want to write them down somewhere and have them documented. And there's not like a format for them. I'm just saying, kind of your script will help, your storyboard will help, all the pre-production stuff will help, your character design Bible and things like that. All that'll help. But it's kind of in your hands then to sit down and put yourself in that place and then draw the activity as you feel that character would embody the activity. Let me know if there are questions, because that actually gets kind of deep. What you need to I guess live in a way. Sorry, I'm checking things. Anyway, so what you're trying to build is empathy between your audience and the character. And one thing that the author of, one thing that Hooks, I had like a brain fart. I was like, what's in it? What's the name of that book? One thing that Hooks talks about is building empathy, and a key part of empathy is figuring out how is the character trying to survive. And that sounds kind of weird in terms of, like, not everything is a Jack London book, right? Not every character is out necessarily, but from a standpoint, like a basic standpoint, your character is ultimately trying to live their life. And what does that mean? Does it mean that they're trying to, and I mean, all of us are having these like experiences with this in this day and age, but it's like trying to pay your bills and watch your kids, or is it that you're trying to meet a deadline, or are you trying to fight a dragon? Are you trying to win the race? Are you trying to win state? And I sound like such an academic, not knowing how sports works when I say it like that. You know what I mean? Like, are you a team trying to win state? Are you trying to like become the homecoming king and queen? That kind of stuff. So whatever that motivation, that like whatever it is to survive in this character's world, is to have the perfect wedding. Whatever that is, you need to know that, and you need to embody that, and that gives all of your character's actions justification. Not like moral justification, but like in their brain, I guess, more moral justification. And how you communicate that can be really important. One recommendation that I found, again, you should go read this whole thing online. It's really good, but it's a lot longer. One thing that I thought would be really good to think about, though, that could move you really farther along in this, is the idea that when you're doing justification and developing the motivation behind your character's goals, stifled emotions, you want to work in nuance. You don't want to be like, I'm happy, and then have the character, unless you are doing this like really shallow, you need a quick gag cartoon character, you can have like big explosive emotions, or maybe, you're animating SpongeBob or somebody, where that's kind of how that character works. Or you're doing an anime and the character has big explosive emotions and then is confronted and like opens up to the other character. That's an anime trope. The idea being that when you work in stifled emotions, and not to say that it's like, I have hidden emotions because I'm gritty and dark. I don't trust the world. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just like normal human behavior. That can be better than the full-blown like, I'm happy, I'm mad. You don't want to be so, again, 100% literal. So the example that Hooks gives, which I think is a really good one, is a comparison between two actors from the silent era, Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. That's why they're here. But the way he says it is, if Keaton were to get his foot stuck in a bucket in one of his movies, he would start to shake the leg around to get the bucket off in a really like immediate, fast, funny way to get the don't call out Shadow the Hedgehog. That's good. That's funny because I was trying to do like a Piccolo voice. Anime like cast pictures always have like when you have the Frozen or Hotel Transylvania like movie poster in American animation, you always have the like, in anime you always have like, and then the character, you always have the character that's doing this. So I was like doing my Piccolo voice. So yeah, but yeah, Shadow the Hedgehog too he's kind of he's a trope. The mood. Anyway, so Chaplin versus Keaton. Keaton, and this is like criticize Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton was and is brilliant, because he's not alive anymore, but because like his movies are great. But he would go for the gag. Like in most of his movies, and that's not to say all movies, but he would go for like the quick sort of gag reaction. That he got a bucket stuck to his foot in a movie. Chaplin would get his foot stuck in the bucket, but like act kind of embarrassed about it, and like try to maybe make it not obvious that he would get it off, but maybe look like, yeah, I totally meant to put it on there. And that stifled emotion creates more character nuance and actually can become funnier. it's a different style for sure, but they're, you know, this is a good way, I think it's a good analogy to think about how the, you know, how you want to act in these situations when you're acting with a character. Is, are you doing that sort of like, are you adding layers of like, I meant to have this bucket on my foot, this is my new shoe style I'm trying out, you know, while they're like, the character turns around and they're like fiendishly trying to remove it, and then the other character turns around again maybe and then goes, hey, what's up, check out my bucket, check out my foot bucket. You know, there's comedy in having the character like try to be cool in situations like that, and that's not a diatribe on being cool, it's a diatribe on like creating emotional complexity, empathy through nuanced emotion rather than through like, yeah, you know. So when you make characters seem more real and genuine, they can seem more real and genuine, and the audience connects to them better. So a brief thing on improv, and I think this is another area you might want to look at the guide. But I pulled out what I thought was a really interesting point about improv here, is that one thing that they talk about is that when you are, one quote from Keith Johnstone, who's the king of improv, said, the more obvious you are, the more original you appear. So improv is like based on a lot of really big, blunt, obvious thing, like obvious motions and reactions. So it almost breaks that nuance rule. Nuance is something you probably develop more over time. If you were an actor prepping, improv is more like if you kind of are, you know, using, it's like the Occam's razor, like the most obvious solution is the best solution, or the right solution version of, and sorry if I'm like totally butchering Occam's razor, but you know, it's like the most obvious version of something is the one you go with. And they talk a lot about in the workshop on acting for animators, where your character's center of motion is, and that center of motion can give you like a good starting point on like figuring out how your character is going to move and how to act with them. So like, for example, if the center is in the character's hips, they maybe move like a supermodel on the catwalk, or they move like you know, they've got moves like Jagger. When the power center is in a character's chin, they move like a queen or a king. You know, somebody regal, like the chin is leading. When the power center is in the character's chest, you know, like superhero, boxer, you know, and you know, forehead intellectual, like moving around like that's how I walk. You know, I walk around all like this. You don't see it because I'm stuck in my house, but you know, that's how all of us walk when we're having research meetings. You know, belly is like tubby character, like and the improv part is also focused on these like status relationships. So high status, you're very still, you make eye contact, you're comfortable. You know, that's like, you know, if you're in a place of authority in the scene, you act with high status. If you're low status, you know, look down a lot. You're like Mr. Scrooge, you know, it's customary to have Christmas Day off. It's like the whole day, you know, you have that kind of, that power dynamic is really important. Actually, that would be a fun scene to animate. So one thing, we can't do this. I would totally do this if we were in the classroom, but one improv game that was brought up, and a way to make you think about improving and how these character dynamics and motions work, is that is called the boss workers exercise. So what you do is two people using a stack of cards numbered 1 to 10 hold the card to their forehead so that the other can see what the number is. The card represents status 1 being a low status and 10 being a high status. Then what you do is, so I'm like, let's say, you know, me and one of you are playing this game, and you know, I have a card on my head, and you see that the card is a 1, and you'd start to be like, you there, get me a tankard of ale. And if I and I see that you have a 10, I'd be like, oh, yes sir. So it's not always neat. The point of it is that, like, if I it's based on, like, you are reacting to the other person, and that reaction that I observe from the other actor is supposed to guide my performance. That's how this is supposed to work. But that improv game, because you don't know what your own number is, you know what the other number is, so you know how they are treating you, gives you a way that you're supposed to react to being treated. But, like, maybe so, like, imagine we were both 10, and, like, neither of us knew that we were 10, and, like, I started being like, oh yes, your majesty. You'd start acting kind of, but then we both did it. Then we'd be like, we could start being like, well, what if two kings were arguing over something? I shall send my army. You can do stuff like that. But the idea being that, like, through playing this game, you have to make it up on the fly, because there's an unknown to it, and the goal is to have, like, an interesting scene. And that's where you can use these as, like, okay, well, if I'm in a high status position, I can start to act with my chin, with my hip, with, start to base my movements from these centers of gravity. Let me know if there are any questions on that or you need more clarification. But those are some improv tricks that they say to use. And then this one, I'm not going to read all these. This is just a list of stuff. But again, these are ideas for character analysis. This is what I was talking about when I said that, like, somebody I knew who was an actor was like, here's who this person I'm being is, even though they don't actually have any speaking lines. Again, that can be a very informative and very real, method to flesh out a character. And they are basically deciding on all of these aspects of this character. So, it's not like, name, origin, place, blood type. It's more than that. It's like, what are their culture? What are their family values? What environments do they live in? It's very much like if you're playing D&D, you go through, like, the player's handbook, and you go through the guide of who the characters are. I would even say that, like, so we bought a few years ago, my daughter, the My Little Pony role-playing game, and, like, that game actually has a really shockingly great character building thing, because it is mostly based on emotion, and things like that. Everything that you do on your character sheet, it's like, yeah, you roll for your stats, but a lot of it is like, what's your, like, flaw? And you have to write in, like, I like cupcakes way too much. And then, like, that makes you like, oh man, cupcakes, ah! Like, rah, rah, rah. That, informs your acting as you are being your character. So how does this all play out, though, when you're animating? Is like, well, obviously it plays out in your drawing, but how does it... Is there, like, an easier way to bottle this up, right? Instead of just being like, okay, let me imagine this. Ah, yes, my perfect soliloquy on my paper. That's not how really it works. I'm sure you notice that, like, when I am teaching, I'm bouncing around in this chair. I'm hyper aware of this like square that I'm in, right? So, there's... You want to, like, being an animator is, you kind of end up being animated in a way. All the animators I know are very emotive, and especially, like, if you've been doing a lot of animation recently, you'll just be like, oh, let me practice my pratfalls. you are very emotive and animated. And one way that you develop that, and that can help you, is it's almost like internally you're trying out your animation, right? You are kind of like playing motions to figure them out. And I've talked about this before, where I've done I was working on that Moon character for Nemo and was like doing facial changes, to figure out like how the emotions would work. And, then I would like look at myself in the mirror and then figure it out and then draw it. So that's one way. The other thing, again, have the mirror in front of you. This is somebody animating Bugs Bunny. He had a mirror at his desk so that he could watch himself animate Bugs Bunny. But you also see animators, maybe even take video of themselves, like I talked about with the Big Buck Bunny shot, where the person would like have themselves on camera and would like toss tennis balls at their head to like understand that this character would go like, how do you react when you get hit with a thing in the head? So it's not uncommon for animators to film themselves and then play that back as they are, sitting there at Maya or at their desk. So that's where you can actually, again, in your workflow, incorporate how to do this. Again, don't be worried about looking dorky, because one, you're an animator. This is your job. Like, so it's kind of interesting. This is like a real talk time. And while I'm doing real talk time, please ask your questions. In fact, ask 2 questions such that we may move on. But I'll do real talk time here while you catch up and get to your questions. So I talk about this with my Games for Education people too, or really all my game designers, but Games for Education specifically, because while I found that people in this program in particular are like pretty down with like, yeah, I like games and I'm going to play games and I'm going to make games. There's, in that field in particular, historically there's been a trepidation to like, well, I want to, make things for my environmental lobbying group, but like, I don't want to play a game. I don't want to be one of those gamers. Ugh. And I have to remind them that, well, okay, but you've crossed a bridge here in your life where you are paying for an academic program with lots of money, with lots of your money to get a credential and do this for money, professionally. So it ceases to be a weird status thing to play a video game or to play role-playing games or board games. It's now a mechanism for you to understand the field that you are now professionally aligning yourself with. So it becomes your professional responsibility. And I think the same thing occurs in animation, where people are like, yeah, well, I don't really want to act all goofy, even if it's like only a video that I show myself. Like, that's weird. How else are you gonna... I mean, I guess you could like internalize everything and never be goofy externally, but also why would you like get rid of that really great reference of yourself? So this is why I recommend people, I don't know, like even if it's just internal, even if it's just in front of a mirror by yourself, like allow yourself that ability to be kind of a dork. Because you're like professionally allowed to be that dork. And if somebody's like, oh, look at that dork, be like, I'm a good animator. Oop. Here I go, knocking my camera off again. You'd be like, well, I'm a professional animator, so this is my professional responsibility to act dorky. So that's something I want you to think about, is like, don't be afraid to take these steps and do these weird these things that, as you start out, you think might be kind of weird. I've got like kind of with the light coming in, I've got like a Two-Face thing. Like here's the white part of the suit and like the dark part of the suit. But it's like you're professionally allowed to, and it's a supply, it's a tool of yours to be able to act these things out in front of a camera. So absolutely use it, because like why? I mean, I guess if you want to shoot yourself in the foot, but it can be very helpful to use that stuff. I don't see two questions. I can't move on until two questions. Like this is my slide switching hand, and like see, it's dead. It needs two questions to live, or else it'll just fade away like Marty McFly. You know, it'll like go away. So it needs your two questions such that it might have the will to move the slideshow forward. So go at it. Is your games for education class always taught in the fall? Yes. That is the fall class. A similar class that we have is game prototyping, which is taught in the spring. And that class is, I mean, they follow very similar formats. The difference in prototyping is that I don't require a paper, and because like games for education, that field of transformational games usually comes with a research component, so I require paper. Game prototyping is like much more, let's make lots of little games. That's the format. But they follow similar sort of like, let's deep dive into game design through applied processes. But thank you for asking about that. Everybody sign up for game prototyping. It's awesome. It's super fun, and we make retro games. Who is that picture? One of the animators at Disney who worked on Zootopia. I can't remember her name. Do companies like to see people who are comfortable referencing themselves? I mean, I don't really know if it's something that they ask for specifically on a resume, but again, it's like more or less a accepted industry practice, so you should do it because it's a good way to make your animations better. That was a good question, though. I don't think it's like a thing that you put on your resume, but it is a thing where it's like, if you're working on something, you should do it. I would say this. There is like totally an element of this, too, that your animations may end up being very much like have idiosyncrasies of you in them. If you've ever read the Dark Tower book series by Stephen King, I'll do a little bit of a spoiler if you've never read them, but at one point they encounter Stephen King, because it's like a meta-fiction book. So like there's references to the fact that they are in a book, and then they realize they're in a book. So they meet Stephen King at one point, and they all remark that each of them looks a little bit like Stephen King, and that's not because he's like pandering to himself. It's that he's acknowledging this really interesting relationship between an author and their characters, where the author will always have, like, the character will always have some part of the author, and I thought that was a really cool way to do it. But it reminds me with characters where, like, I've known animators and artists who, like, if you ask them to draw a character doing a certain thing, it'll be like, that's the face you make when you do that. So there is definitely like an element of this. So, I think when you're talking about referencing yourself, there is always going to be a little bit. It's not a job skill. It's just something that you A, should do, and B, will make your animations better. And again, like, it's one of those, like, you may even be uncomfortable with that, but like, you should totally do it, because why would you not? Reminds me of when I had one class of students. So like my code is my code from GDC, and it's like a legitimately, if you ever make it out to the Game Developers Conference, their shop has like there are some times where you go to stuff and it's like branded and it's cheap, but like it's actually legitimately good stuff. I bought a jacket. It's like a nice jacket, so I wear it. It's my black jacket that you might have seen me in. And And I remember, like, I had a student one time be like, "You're such a dork. You wear your GDC jacket." It's like, I've spoken at GDC. You want to be this dorky. It's like, you're literally here to learn to be this dork. So, it's like, let go of, I don't know, the high school or even some college social scenarios. Think about, like, yeah, you can be that dork. Be the dork. Because that'll, the biggest dorks are the more successful people, because they're allowed to, like, lose themselves in the music, the moment, anyway. So can you drop this GIF in the class server? I want to take a better look at it, but the streams always make your GIFs lag. Yeah, it's also probably because I'm streaming camera too. So yes, I can. But so let's talk force versus form. Now, so this is like a different topic. This is a different workshop. I'm putting it into acting for a number of reasons. Being a dork is fun, yay! So force versus form. Force implies weight and balance in your animations. And we've talked about this. We talked about squash and stretch and physical reality and follow through and anticipation and all of these things and the physics of your character. But this is like, let's really focus on that. Let's focus on that element of, like, the body as a physical object. So in workflow, you do this, you focus on force by combining elements of straight ahead and pose-to-pose animation. And I'll talk about how that's done in a second. So force can be used, and I talk about physical force, mass, acceleration, deceleration, things like that. Physical forces can be used in your animations to imply weight and balance and to make your characters seem, again, more realistic. So this is where, we've had, so first of all, force is not some mysterious energy, out of reach to all but a select few. I just wanted to use a Baby Yoda gif. It's something that we can tap into. And you may recall several weeks ago we looked at, when we were talking about studying motion, we looked at, in Sleeping Beauty, to understand characters' dances, they watched real dancers. They did the same thing for, like, What's Opera Doc. They actually watched ballet so that they could have the characters move like they were in a ballet. So this actually really, you want to base everything on real physical. And I've even seen some of you do the same thing where you, like, do a little light rotoscoping of characters and things like that. And they're, like, absolutely magical, right? So, understanding the way that the body moves is really important. There's even this book called, by Michael D. Matisse, called Force, Dynamic Life Drawing for Animators. You should totally check this out. It's a really excellent book. But, we want to focus on the physical forces that move through your body. And the way that you work with this in animation is you want to think in what are called extremes. So extremes are, it's really just keyframes, but it's a way to think about keyframes in that you want to make your keyframes work in such a way that you are, there's an aspect of pushing the pose to it, but you're pushing the pose in relation to some sort of physical force, whether that be, like, I'm leaning back, so I really want to emphasize the body's, motion. I'm lifting a heavy object. You want to emphasize those physical interactions between things. And when you draw extremes, body poses, it's that you then, for your keyframes and your breakdowns, then what you do is you use straight ahead to draw your in-betweens. You're kind of like following the forces through your in-betweens. So you're setting up keyframes and breakdowns as being like key parts in reacting to a force on the body, and then you use straight ahead to fill in the gaps. Now this, you don't have to do this for every single thing you ever do, but if you are doing something like somebody, pitching in a baseball game, or a character lifting up a medicine ball, or, something like that, we want to see that. In fact, when we've interviewed animation faculty in the past, we have them do an animation test, and the animation test we've had them do is pick up an object and throw it. And this one guy came in, we weren't able to hire him, which was a bummer. I was super sad about this. But he took a video of himself in the gym picking up a medicine ball and then throwing it. And then he took his animation, so he used that as reference for timing, and he loaded that into Maya as or he had it open while he was animating in Maya, really, is what happened. But he go to the frame he wanted to be on, and then he did actually this is potentially really helpful, really informative for you all who are looking for the ways that 2D and 3D can work together. Sorry, I'm slowly trying to tilt out of the way of the sun. This person took a video of themselves picking up the medicine ball, and then they, used, on the computer, did 2D traceovers of the video in, After Effects or Photoshop or something, of, the frames that he was going to do, so the poses. And then he, maybe did another pass to maybe push the poses a little bit to make them more animation friendly, and add emphasize the forces, and then would have those drawings in front of him while he then posed the character in Maya to get the animation he wanted. So he went from a video of himself to paint overs or draw overs, I guess, to rough out the poses and how they'd look in animation, to actually posing in Maya. But that was a way that he was able to play up the force of a real medicine ball by using that video reference to himself. So forces, again, they're about they're not mysterious. They are things that really happen. And when you talk about forces, and when you talk about the body, anytime you draw a character, you want to figure out what are the opposing forces, because those create balance. So is the character just leaning to the side? This is kind of an extreme version, but you can see in leaning back in an extreme way, the front of the body, and you can see the hips are out forward. The bottom of the body has to compensate by leaning back. So, and the same thing happens in 3D. When you are posing a 3D character, you want to really, for example, look in the middle, the character swinging an axe or a baseball bat, the hips are out, and the bat and the big giant, whatever it is they're holding are backward, and that's creating a backward force on the body because it's heavy. So the rest of the body, the hips, that center of gravity, has to compensate. You don't want to just be for swinging an axe, you want to be "Ugh." You want to communicate this is giant and will hurt if it hits you. When you do baseball swing, same thing. You want to, motion to create momentum. Golf swing, same kind of thing. But you want to, think about when you're doing motions like this, or really any simple motion, because this doesn't just occur for big athletic things. This can occur for, dancing, jumping, posing, running, most things that you do want to have some element of balance. And when you're drawing, a good way to do that is if you can draw a center line down your drawing, you should roughly have the same amount of body on either side balancing each other out, so that the body can again, it feels balanced. Because if you have it weighted to one side or another, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on this one here, this character here that's jumping and bending backwards like this, if he were just bending backwards and his feet were forward, he would just be falling. if you're not in balance, you're falling. If you are in balance, then you're steady. So acknowledging the balance of the body is really important when creating some animated poses. Again, also when you are picking up like a heavy object like this jug of water. So focusing on these forces can be really important when you are so focusing on these forces can be incredibly important and can add a lot of dynamism to your drawings. So, here's a nice before and after from the website for the Forces book. Before, the characters are rendered well, but they're just standing kind of statically. Whereas if you start to think about the body and their poses in Forces, you get more dynamism. At the top, you really get a sense of like the muscles of this wolf's face moving around, as opposed to, again, just a nice drawing. And then the bottom character, you really get a sense of her interacting with her environment in like the mountain climbing and when she's, walking or trying to walk carefully, or, when she's sitting on that log, figuring out like how your character's body is sitting physically, not literally sitting, but how the forces are distributed across of it will help you make better poses. And again, taking pictures of yourself is helpful. I've done that when I'm drawing characters. I will like take a picture of myself and then use that as a reference. This keyframes, breakdowns, and in-betweens, but you see where extremes fit into. Extremes are the start and end points of an action. You want to think of some of your key poses as extremes to really push the pose, and that pushing the pose often can include like emphasizing physical forces. So here's a character using forces to emphasize a board sit. It's a much better pose for a board sit than the one on the right. Let me know if there are any questions on the forces real quick. I'm not going to do the two things because I want to get this finished. So forces can really help your animation acting. See what I did there? Animation acting. So there is a concept called Laban, which is movement analysis. And it's an important... So there are whole books on this, so I'm not going to try to incorporate the entire book. But basically the idea is like there is this set of principles of movement analysis. It's an important part of establishing a character and how it moves quickly. Again, this comes from improv. And this is in the animation Acting for Animators tutorial thing that I posted on the animation link. So go check this out. But they talk about the 4 elements of dimensional scale, which are space, time, and weight. So space, time, and weight create the flow of action. So you want to think about the space that you have to move, the space it's going to take to do your movements, the time in which it's going to take to do your movements, and the weight that you will distribute through the movement. And having those things will create a different flow of action. So what they say in terms of space, time, and weight in particular are space you can think of as indirect crossing of space or indirect crossing of space. So direct crossing of space is you go straight to your target. Now that can mean the actual target, like I'm fighting something, or it can mean like I want to walk there. And so whether or not you are going directly or indirectly to something versus like, again, I want to eventually get to there, but I'm kind of having a nice day walking outside, and maybe you meander. That's, is there a quick and direct way between point A and point B, or are we going to meander to point A or point B? That can be physically walking, that can be landing a punch, that can be, whatever. Think about this. are you doing a fast walk? That would be a direct walk. Or are you doing the walk that we looked at with Earless Dog where it's going like that? This would be an indirect walk because you're trying to you're going to get here, but you want to kind of take your time with it to emphasize this stuff instead of being again, the professor walk. Fast or slow? Are you doing this fast or slow? Again, timing. Fast is direct, slow is indirect. And then weight, is there a heavy downward force on the thing you're doing, or is it an upward force? If you're doing carrying a boulder, it's down, so you want to emphasize the downward weight. But if it's light and there's an upward force, maybe you're you just found out some great news and you're prancing about, you're like, yay! And then the other thing you want to think about with these motions is it sudden? Is it a sudden motion or a sustained motion? Now, where this comes together is that they make this chart of some types of motions and ways to think of types of motions. So they have four axes. They have four quadrants, or they have these axes with quadrants. The axes are direct to indirect, and then light to heavy as the y-axis. And then in each of them, they divide each quadrant into two of sustained and sudden. So then they've put different actions in this, and it's not that these are all the actions you can ever use, but these are examples. So a light sustained action is like if, you're kind of gliding. Think of a plastic bag in the wind, or a character literally kind of doing a light glide because they have a gliding ability in a video game or something. Light but sudden and indirect might be like a flick. Light and sustained is again a float. Sudden, direct, and light would be dabbing, dabbing. So oh, you got something on your face. Not dabbing, but dabbing. Where heavy and sustained would be pressing, I'm pressing down on my desk, or I'm trying to press my camera down so it stays there instead of falling off. Where heavy and direct, but sudden is like a punch. So you see how this works is you can start to think about, if you think about your motions in this way, are they light or heavy, direct or indirect, sustained or sudden? You can then start to figure out okay, my forces on this needs to be up. Again, if I'm doing it, or if I'm lifting something heavy, you can start to think about okay, it's heavy, so the force has to be down. It's direct because I'm trying to put it on the shelf as fast as I can and not have to lift this thing anymore. And you could think about heavy and direct. You're going from point A to point B very fast. Light and direct, it's still it's direct, but sort of the forces are low, but you understand what's going on here. This gives you a good way of thinking about motion that, gives you some guidelines for doing your drawings and your motions. Let me know if there are any questions on that. But I'm going to move on real quick to what does this all look like as a workflow? So for force versus form, you want to start off with sketches planning out your animation. Okay? And I did that here for Dr. Pill. I made a bunch of sketches that really became my keyframes, but I wanted to map out, and this is all based on the merchant in the Aladdin Sega Genesis video game, because I wanted to basically he's the shop character, so we wanted to base it on that and have a nice little reference, plus, have the sort of your shop goes bring suddenly. So we wanted to have a character like that. So I did some sketches planning out the animation, and then these turned into, in Blender, a set of keyframes. So I did that as like a blocking pass, which is where I draw all the key poses from first to last. So I just did key poses. And that's, like again, it looks choppy because there's no in-betweens, but I look at all the key poses and I distribute the frames on the timeline. I can move them so that I can see like where the timing works. When you're doing this blocking pass and just drawing your extreme keyframes, you're not going back. You're not doing, overlapping action or in betweens or anything. You're just doing extremes and breakdowns, key phrases and keyframes and breakdowns. So. These principles as much as possible. So, and then, try to incorporate principles as you're doing these keys. But then after you do the first blocking pass, then you start adding your further breakdowns and in-betweens to adjust timing. So this is sort of like the second pass is where you're like refining the motion that you've already built with more in-between stuff. That's where you're, again, moving around some of your timelines, adding the in-betweens, and you're starting to see your motion play out. Now I'm showing the ink here to give you, like, for clarity. You don't ink and paint yet. Like, this is all in your pencils or roughs. This is not in your inks and paints. That's like another job, right? I'm talking about just building. I just added the inks here for clarity. But refining pass is about all your overlapping action, your exaggeration, and any moving holds you're doing, which, if you recall, moving holds are like where if your character's standing still, you're going to have like some slight movement, a breathing or a blinking or a going up and down so that the character's not super duper still. That's more in 3D animation than 2D. But that's where you are going to like go back and add the follow through, the coattails, the hat, the ears, things like that. The third pass is where you are almost like double checking, is the weight and balance of all these poses looking good? Is everything, lining up? Like, are things consistent between one pose and another? So you're kind of like correcting in the third pass. And then polishing is where you are like bringing it all together. You're fixing anything. You're making sure that your motions have nice arcs. And I've talked about that where I'm like, I was animating this character and then I looked at like, for the moon, like the craters on the side of his face, and I just kind of like moved them around. But I would go back at the end and like start to turn them into like its motion path into little arcs to make them nice and smooth. So you want to track those things at the polish phase. And again, we're still doing this out of ink and paint. You see 2 frames flashing here just because I've drawn them as concept art. But then you refine it all and you have your full animation, and then again you do your ink and paint all on top of that. That's a separate phase. So that's it. Ask me a question, and then we can call this. How was my Halloween? It was good. With the kids, we didn't go trick-or-treating for obvious reasons. We had like a Halloween party with my parents who are on our quarantine. Basically, we don't see other people besides each other. But we just like bought a bunch of candy and then did like a scout. I mean, we basically did an Easter egg hunt, but for candy for the kids around the house. So that was. I hope everybody else had a good Halloween. You'll pardon me if I've forgotten over the last 3 days that it was recently Halloween. There's busy few days. Hope everybody's taking time for self-care in this trying week. But yeah. Any other questions? Well, if not, I will gladly answer questions in Discord. Thank you for being cool about the Thursday lecture thing. We did it, Thursday lecture. But I will talk to everybody later and have a good weekend and be